Welcome to our special news update on MCR. I'm Mayank Chhaya. Did the US negotiators know as early as February 2020 or even earlier that the Taliban was under no pressure to offer more than bare minimum guarantees to clinch a peace deal in Doha in Qatar? The answer to this key question appears to be a clear yes, if a damning assessment of what unfolded behind the scenes in Afghanistan by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, is any guide. By the time the Taliban came to the negotiating table with the Trump administration in 2020, it had been ascendant on the battlefield for more than a decade. SIGAR's 140-page report says it was poorly motivated to indulge peace talks beyond what was necessary to secure the release of more than 5,000 prisoners, ensure the removal of US and UN sanctions, accrue international legitimacy, and claim credit for negotiating the departure of US forces. Notably, none of these objectives required compromise with the Afghan government, the report says. Quite stunningly, the SIGAR report also quotes a senior Afghan government negotiator as saying, and I quote, "The Taliban thought they were just there to discuss the terms of the government surrender. They said, we don't need to talk to you, we can just take over," unquote. As it turned out, in the last couple of weeks or so, the Taliban could indeed just take over Afghanistan, notwithstanding that the US has spent $145 billion trying to rebuild Afghanistan, its security forces, civilian government institutions, economy, and civil society. And the Department of Defense, or DoD, has also spent $837 billion on war fighting. Of course, the total amount of taxpayer dollars spent on a war that has brought nothing but defeat and ignominy is said to be over $2.26 trillion. The SIGAR report makes several important points which stand out in sharp relief because of the hugely problematic withdrawal of the US troops that left America's local Afghan allies in extraordinary distress and even in mortal danger. For instance, the report quotes Douglas Lute, who coordinated Afghanistan's strategy at the National Security Council from 2007 to 2013, as saying, "The US is devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We did not know what we were doing. We did not have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. It's really much worse than you think. There was a fundamental gap of understanding on the front end, overstated objectives, and an over-reliance on the military, and a lack of understanding of the resources necessary," unquote. Speaking of over-reliance on the military, consider these numbers. The US State Department, which is the lead agency on Afghanistan, has a budget and staff that pale in comparison to those of the Department of Defenses. This year, for instance, Congress appropriated $696 billion for defense, compared to a mere $56 billion for the State Department. The State Department has a total of only 24,000 American employees, a number that is fewer than the number of US troops stationed in South Korea alone, and which is dwarfed by the 1.4 million troops in the US military globally. The State Department's 7,900 Foreign Service officer, the backbone of the agency, only slightly outnumber the musicians employed in the DoD bands. As SIGAR points out, throughout the 20-year campaign, there were recurring complaints by US officials and commentators that there was no strategy. For example, in 2009, when then Vice President and now President Joe Biden returned from a trip to Afghanistan, he told President Barack Obama, and I quote, "If you ask 10 of our people what we are trying to accomplish here, you get 10 different answers. This has been on autopilot," unquote. SIGAR points out, and I quote again, "The US government consistently underestimated the amount of time required to rebuild Afghanistan and created unrealistic timelines and expectations that prioritize spending quickly. These choices increase corruption and reduce the effectiveness of programs. Unquote. It also says that the US government continuously struggled to develop and implement a coherent strategy for what it hoped to achieve. The US government's inability to get the right people into the right jobs at the right time was one of the most significant failures of the mission, the report says. It is also one of the hardest to repair. US personnel in Afghanistan were often unqualified and poorly trained, and those who were qualified were difficult to retain. The Department of Defense police advisors watched American TV shows to learn about policing. Civil affairs teams were mass produced via PowerPoint presentations, and every agency experienced annual lobotomies as staff constantly rotated out, leaving successors to start from scratch and make similar mistakes all over again. These dynamics had direct effects on the quality of reconstruction. Unquote. What had begun in 2010 as the Taliban's gradual ascendancy was by 2017 at a stage where the violent group barely felt any pressure to yield to any major demands from the US. It is hardly surprising that in a mockery of the so-called US intelligence projection that Kabul could fall within 30 to 60 days, the capital actually caved in barely 48 hours. What happens to the US policy on Afghanistan now is gravely uncertain, especially with the Taliban now in control of not just Kabul and the rest of the country, but even in possession of a huge cache of often unopened arms and ammunition left behind by the departing US forces. This is Mayank Chhaya Reports, special news update on Afghanistan.